This is a homily for the third Sunday of Advent. The first reading is from the prophet Zephaniah, chapter 3, verses 14 to 18. The second reading comes from the letter of St. Paul to the Philippians, chapter 4, verses 4 to 7. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 3, verses 10 to 18. You can download the text of this homily as a PDF file at sundayhomilies.au. The third Sunday of Advent is traditionally known as Gaudete Sunday. Gaudete is the Latin word for rejoice. Today we make our own the words of St. Paul to the Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice, the Lord is near. And on this Sunday we light the third candle of the Advent wreath, the rose-coloured candle, another symbol of joy. Today is one of only 2 Sundays of the year when the priests may wear rose-coloured vestments. The other Sunday is Laetare Sunday, the 4th Sunday of Lent. Here you can see Pope Francis wearing a rose-coloured chasuble. So with Christmas only a week and a half away, Gaudete Sunday bids us rejoice because the celebration of the birth of our Saviour is close at hand. As we saw on the first Sunday of Advent, the word Advent means approach, coming, or arrival. The readings of the Advent season therefore point us in 2 directions. Because Advent is a season of preparation for Christmas, we look back to the first coming of Christ, to his birth at Bethlehem. But we also look forward to the final coming of Christ in glory, to the day of the Lord. Advent acknowledges that God has already acted definitively on our behalf, and God will act definitively in the future to bring his purposes to pass once and for all. In the Old Testament, the day of the Lord is the day when Yahweh will vindicate Israel by defeating its enemies, rescuing his people once and for all, and restoring the fortunes of Israel. Amos, who lived in the 8th century BC, was the first prophet to use the term the day of Yahweh, and it became an important concept in subsequent prophetic and apocalyptic literature. Today's first reading comes from the prophet Zephaniah, and the most striking point in the preaching of Zephaniah is the announcement of the day of the Lord. Paul and other New Testament writers regularly refer to the day of the Lord, but they mean it in a Christian sense. The Lord is Jesus himself. In today's first reading from the prophet Zephaniah, we hear the words, "On that day it will be said to Jerusalem, Zion, have no fear, do not let your hands fall limp. The Lord your God is within you, the saving warrior." And in today's second reading, St. Paul urges the Philippians, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I say again, rejoice. Let your good sense be known to everyone. The Lord is near." The Gospels for the second and third Sundays of Advent look back, not to the birth of Christ, but to the prelude to the public ministry of Jesus. For 2 Sundays, last Sunday and today, the spotlight is on John the Baptist. In fact, all 4 Gospels agree that there is no Gospel story without John the Baptist at the opening. In today's Gospel, John the Baptist says, "I baptize you with water, but someone is coming, someone who is more powerful than I am, and I am not fit to undo the strap of his sandals. There is a profound lesson to be learnt in these few words. Will Storr's book, Selfie, How the West Became Self-Obsessed, tells the story of the love affair between Western societies and the self. The significance of the book's title, Selfie, is one of Storr's most telling observations. When we develop the technology to take pictures anywhere and any time with devices that we carry with us everywhere we go, what do we mostly take pictures of? Ourselves. Storr describes the various ways in which the self has been understood in past societies, but focuses on the extraordinary growth of self-focused therapy and ideology in more recent times. The American writer David Brooks also examines the contemporary obsession with the self. In his book, The Road to Character, Brooks writes about two kinds of people that he meets. One group of people he labels the big me, and the other group as the summoned self. As the label the big me suggests, it is about putting myself at the centre of the universe. Brooks writes, "We have moved from a culture that encouraged people to think humbly of themselves to a culture that encourages people to see themselves as the centre of the universe." By way of example, Brooks tells us that the early Girl Scout handbooks preached an ethic of self-sacrifice and self-effacement. The chief obstacle to happiness, the handbook exhorted, comes from the over-eager desire to have people think about you. However, things quickly changed. By 1980, the tone was very different. You Make the Difference, the handbook for cadet and senior Girl Scouts, was telling girls to pay more attention to themselves. How can you get more in touch with you? What are you feeling? Every option available to you through senior scouting can, in some way, help you to a better understanding of yourself. Put yourself in the centre stage of your thoughts to gain perspective on your own ways of feeling, thinking, and acting. Brooks contrasts the big me with what he calls the summoned self. The summoned self both listens and looks. What does this environment need in order to be made whole? What is it that needs repair? What tasks are lying around waiting to be performed? At what points do my talents meet the world's deep need? The Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar called our obsession with the self an ego drama. The ego drama is all about me. I'm at the centre of the universe. I want to write the script for the great epic that my life is. I'm directing it. I'm the producer. And most of all, I get to play the starring role. Everyone else in this world should consider themselves extremely fortunate to be given a bit part to play in the drama of my life. It's all about me. Von Balthasar contrasts the ego drama with the theo-drama. The Greek word for God is theos, so theo-drama means the God drama. It means placing God at the centre of my life. It summons me beyond the narrow confines of my own ego. John the Baptist lived the theo-drama. His whole life was lived for one purpose, to point beyond himself and to declare the imminent arrival of the coming Messiah. And he says he is not fit to undo the strap of his sandals. In John's Gospel, the Baptist says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." Those words of the Baptist explain why the Church celebrates his feast day on June the 24th, around the time of the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere. The New Testament doesn't give us any clues about the date of John the Baptist's birth, so the Church chose the day of the summer solstice. Following the summer solstice, the days get progressively shorter. So the dwindling days of summer symbolize the role of the Baptist. He decreases as the day of the Messiah approaches. Hans Urs von Balthasar reminds us, "He must increase, but I must decrease." He sets an example for all Christians, all apostles, priests, all who proclaim Christ. None of them may proclaim themselves, chatter about their own religious experience. They are to be only the voice of him who is increasing, who is always the greater. I'm reminded of St. Charles de Foucauld, who chose to live among Muslims in the Sahara Desert. He said that he was not attempting to convert them, but to understand them, and to look upon every human being as a beloved brother or sister. He once said, "I would like to be sufficiently good that people would say, 'If such is the servant, what must the master be like?'" In this icon, you can see St. Charles standing alongside Jesus, pointing to him. His life and ministry could be likened to that of John the Baptist. What do we know of John the Baptist? Luke tells us that his parents were Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah was a priest who belonged to the Abijah section of the priesthood. Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron, so she too came from a priestly family. Zechariah and Elizabeth were both advanced in years and were childless. Priesthood was hereditary, so John, like his father, was also a priest. The name John means God is gracious. Luke tells us that it was the turn of Zechariah's section to serve in the temple. Priests were divided into 24 divisions, and each division was rostered to serve in the temple for 1 week every 6 months. The various duties were assigned by lot, and it fell to Zechariah to enter the Lord's sanctuary and burn incense there. The altar of sacrifice was outside in front of the temple, but the altar of incense was located inside the temple in the holy place, in front of the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. The angel of the Lord, who identifies himself as Gabriel, appears to Zechariah and tells him his wife Elizabeth is to bear a son, and the son is to be named John. And again, the name John means God is gracious. When Zechariah's time of service was completed, he returned home. And where is home? Luke simply tells us that it is a town in the hill country of Judah. An ancient tradition locates the house of Zechariah and Elizabeth and therefore the place where John the Baptist was born, at Ein Karem. What was once a village has now been incorporated into the far western suburbs of Jerusalem. By road today, the distance is about 7 kilometres, and it takes about 12 minutes by car. At the time of Jesus, many priests liked to live within walking distance of the temple. Here you can see the church of St. John the Baptist in Ein Karem. The first church on this site was built in the 4th century AD. That Byzantine church was destroyed in the 7th century, restored by the Crusaders, and then destroyed again after the Crusaders left the country. The church one visits today was built in 1674. The complex includes the grotto of the Nativity of St. John, and an ancient tradition identifies this grotto as part of the house of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and hence the place where John the Baptist was born. Luke's Gospel tells us that John lived in the desert until the day he appeared openly to Israel. This means that John had forsaken the role of priest. New Testament scholar John Mayer explains the significance of this. John was the only son of a priest who functioned in the Jerusalem temple. The only son of a Jerusalem priest would have a solemn duty to follow his father in his function and to make sure that the priestly line was continued by marriage and children. John, at some point, must have consciously turned his back on and, in Jewish eyes, scandalously rejected his obligation to be a priest in his father's footsteps and to supply priestly descendants after him. Forsaking family duty as well as his priestly duty to the Jerusalem temple, therefore forsaking all that was most sacred to Judaism, he went into the wilderness of Judea to announce imminent judgment and the dire need for moral cleansing on the part of all Jews. The New Testament is not our only source for information on John the Baptist. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was writing at roughly the same time that the Gospels were being written, mentions John in his work entitled Jewish Antiquities. Although Josephus writes about John the Baptist in Jewish Antiquities, he makes no mention of a connection between the Baptist and Jesus. Josephus tells us that John promised cleansing for those who were baptized. He also tells us that Herod Antipas imprisoned John at Machaerus and had him executed. Machaerus was a fortress built by Herod the Great and located within the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas. Antipas had been married to the daughter of Aretas, king of neighbouring Nabatea. When Antipas divorced her and married Herodias, trouble ensued. The divorce enraged his former father-in-law. A disputed boundary was also at issue between the two rulers, so it's difficult to know if the divorce was a cause or a symptom of the conflict that erupted. Aretas attacked Antipas, and in the subsequent battle, Antipas's forces were soundly defeated. Josephus tells us that after Herod Antipas had been defeated in battle by Aretas, some Jews interpreted Herod's defeat as a punishment from God because of what he had done to John. Here you can see a photograph of the ruins of Machaerus. It is located in what today is Jordan. Herod the Great had built the second fortress on this site, probably in 30 BC. After the death of Herod the Great, it came under the control of Herod's son Antipas. Here is another photograph of the ruins and an illustration of what it would have looked like at the time when John the Baptist was imprisoned there. Luke tells us that John the Baptist was in the desert, presumably the desert of Judea, to the west of the Dead Sea. He then tells us that John went into the whole Jordan area, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. John's Gospel gives us further information when he tells us that John was baptizing at Bethany on the far side of the Jordan. This Bethany, just to the north of the Dead Sea, is known as Bethany beyond the Jordan, to distinguish it from the Bethany that is located just to the southeast of Jerusalem. This is a photograph that I took of the place that is traditionally identified as the site where John baptized. The wooden structure at the top protects the archaeological remains of an ancient Christian church built there. Here is another photograph, but this time with some water at the site of the baptism. In the 6th century, a pilgrim by the name of Theodosius visited the site and wrote this account of his visit. At the place where my Lord was baptized is the church of St. John the Baptist, which was constructed by the Emperor Anastasius. It stands on great vaults, which are high enough for when the Jordan is in flood. Anastasius was emperor in Constantinople from 491 to 518 AD. A 12th century pilgrim, Abbot Daniel, wrote that the place where Christ was baptized is distant from the river Jordan as far as a man can throw a small stone. The river Jordan flows just on the other side of the bushes that you can see at the top of this photograph. It is the boundary between the countries of Jordan and the modern state of Israel. Pope Francis visited the site on May the 24th, 2014. The significance of John choosing a site on the eastern side of the Jordan suggests that he saw his ministry as heralding a new exodus. After leaving slavery in Egypt and wandering in the desert for 40 years, the people crossed the river Jordan and entered the promised land. The story is told in the book of Joshua. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. As soon as the bearers of the ark reached the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark touched the waters, the upper waters stood still and formed a single mass over a great distance. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in mid-Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground, until the whole nation had completed its crossing of the Jordan. Those baptized by John in the Jordan were dramatically reenacting what their ancestors had done some 1,500 years earlier. Let's turn to today's Gospel. A group designated by Luke as all the people come to John the Baptist asking, "What must we do?" John says simply, "If anyone has 2 tunics, he must share with the person who has none, and the one with something to eat must do the same." In other words, keep on living the kind of life that you are already living, but you must be generous and compassionate. Share what you have with the poor. Now here we have an important point. God does invite some people to follow him by giving up everything. But for most of us, the call to discipleship doesn't involve such a huge upheaval. For most of us, the call to discipleship is a call to be sensitive to the needs of those around us and to do what we can to help them. Likewise, the tax collectors come to John asking, "What must we do?" The Greek word translated here as tax collector is telonai. A more accurate translation would be toll rather than tax collector. In this period in Palestine, it referred to Jews who were responsible for collecting indirect taxes such as tolls, tariffs, and customs. The Romans auctioned the right to collect such indirect taxes to the highest bidder, who then became the chief toll collector. He in turn employed agents in local toll houses. The chief toll collector had to pay the expected revenue to the Romans in advance. He then sought to recoup this amount plus expenses and profits through the collection of tolls. Obviously, the more he exacted in tolls, the greater his profit. The system of toll collection was therefore obviously open to abuse and dishonesty. Note that John doesn't tell the toll collectors to give up their job and find a more respectable profession. He says, continue doing what you are doing, but exact no more than your rate. In other words, be just and fair in your dealings with others. Be a toll collector with integrity. And then some soldiers asked, what must we do? These were not Roman soldiers. They should be understood as Jews who had enlisted in the service of Herod Antipas. The position that these soldiers held in ancient Palestine meant that they were often guilty of intimidation, blackmail, and extortion. John doesn't tell them to give up their job either. Rather, continue being a soldier, but no intimidation, no extortion. Be content with your pay. The 12th century Benedictine monk St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote about the coming of the Lord. He says, we know that there are 3 comings of the Lord. The third coming is between the other 2 and is not visible in the way they are. The 3 comings that Bernard is talking about are firstly the nativity of the Lord. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And he is also talking about the final coming of Christ at the end of time. But the third coming that Bernard speaks of, a coming between the other 2, is the Lord's coming among us here and now. This coming is not visible in the same way that the first and final comings of the Lord. This is precisely what John the Baptist is saying. We encounter the Lord by doing faithfully what we are already doing. The Japanese religious scholar D.T. Suzuki was an authority on Buddhism, especially Zen and Shin, and he was an early exponent of Zen in the West. On one occasion he was invited to share a meal with a number of distinguished scholars, but the man seated next to him kept asking him questions. Suzuki ate his dinner patiently and said nothing. This man, who knew nothing about Zen, then asked, "How would you sum up Zen for a Westerner like me?" With unusual vigour in his voice, Suzuki looked him in the eye and said, "Eat!" I'll leave you to ponder upon what Suzuki meant by that. I had the great privilege of meeting Mother Teresa in 1971 when I was a student studying for the priesthood in Melbourne. As you may be aware, Mother Teresa founded the Missionaries of Charity, dedicated to working among the poorest of the poor. The Missionaries of Charity had established a refuge for homeless men in Gore Street in the Melbourne suburb of Fitzroy. The men would come to the refuge late in the afternoon. The sisters prepared them an evening meal and the men slept there overnight. The sisters returned to their convent just around the corner, returning early the next morning to prepare breakfast for the men. Young seminarians, such as I was then, would sleep at the refuge overnight just to make sure that everything went smoothly. After completing one of my first nights at the refuge, I noticed that the sisters were really excited as they prepared breakfast. They explained that Mother Teresa had arrived from Calcutta the day before, and she was staying with them at their Fitzroy convent. They suggested that I should call around to the convent and meet Mother Teresa before I left, and I did. The reason I mention this episode was because of the profound effect it had upon me. Meeting Mother Teresa was an extraordinary experience that is hard to put into words. I now realize why artists portray saints with a halo around their heads. Now, I didn't see a halo, but I was certainly aware that I was in the presence of a holy person. But the reason for mentioning all of this was because of something Mother Teresa told me that morning. She said that as soon as she had arrived in Melbourne, a young man approached her saying that he wanted to love and serve God with all his heart, and that he wanted to return with her to work among the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta. Her response? She said, "I could tell that he was an earnest young man, but I said to him, 'Look, if you want to love and serve God with all your heart, you don't need to go any further than Melbourne.'" How true. A handful of people, like Mother Teresa herself, receive the call to serve God in faraway places. But for most of us, the call to serve God is in the here and now. In fact, Mother Teresa was often approached by people wanting to join her in Calcutta, and she invariably replied, "Find your own Calcutta." And she went on to explain, "Don't search for God in far lands. He is not there. He is close to you. He is with you. Just keep the lamp burning, and you will always see him. Watch and pray. Keep kindling the lamp, and you will see his love, and you will see how sweet is the Lord you love." Echoing the sentiments of John the Baptist, Martin Luther King had this to say, "If it falls to your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Michelangelo painted. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Leontine Price sings before the Metropolitan Opera. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, 'Here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well.'" Perhaps Lucy has an Advent message for us. Charlie Brown admits, "I'm in sad shape." Dr. Lucy greets him. "Good morning, sir. Sit right down." "Fine. I was afraid I might need an appointment." And so Charlie Brown unburdens himself. "What can you do when you don't fit in? What can you do when life seems to be passing you by?" Lucy then invites Charlie to follow her. "I want to show you something. See the horizon over there. See how big this world is. See how much room there is for everybody. Have you ever seen any other worlds? No? As far as you know, this is the only world there is, right? Right. There are no other worlds for you to live in, right? Right. You were born to live in this world, right? Right. Well, live in it then. 5 cents, please. Thank you, Lucy, for that Advent message. The Lord comes to us here in this place and now at this time. Discipleship for most of us isn't about doing great things in faraway places. As John the Baptist teaches us, it is about a selfless concern for others right where I am. It's about doing my present job with justice, compassion, and integrity.